Kenna, Bridge of Spirits is an action-adventure game that uses a combination of simple combat mechanics and an endearing aesthetic to pull the player into a fairly engaging narrative, and ultimately, a pretty good time. Kenna Bridge of Spirits was developed and published by Amber Lab. From a console perspective, it was available on the PlayStation 4 and originally released there. It is, however, playable on the PlayStation 5, which is where I played it. The game eventually did release on Steam on PC, so it is also playable there. In terms of physical copies, they are still available and you will find them on the PlayStation 4 version. Here I have the Kenna Bridge of Spirits Deluxe Edition on the PlayStation 4, which is the edition that I played. You will still find copies of this out in the wild. You will also be able to find plenty of pre-owned copies. In terms of its availability going forward, I would say if you are looking to get this, you should probably start getting it sooner rather than later, as eventually they will stop doing new runs of this game. In terms of runtime, the game took about 16 hours for me to complete. Typically, I am on the higher end of the scale in terms of how long it takes to complete games compared to the average player. I think the average player here is probably somewhere between 12 hours to maybe 14 hours, so I was definitely a little bit higher on the upper end with that. And a lot of that time is usually me just exploring the world and really just immersing myself in it. So generally, my time to complete is normally a little bit higher. Players take on the role of Kenna, a spirit guide. Throughout the game, players will journey with Kenna to uncover mysteries about a forgotten village inhabited by lost souls. Players will encounter little creatures called Rot to help Kenna along her way. I must say right now that the Rot are extremely adorable. It's an action-adventure game and players will move through the world using an over-the-shoulder perspective. In general, I like my time with this game. From a visuals perspective, there's a lot to like here. The aesthetics and the animations are all really gorgeous and really well done. The core gameplay loop is very simple but also very engaging as well. From a parenting aspect, this is definitely something that the children can come in and watch without worry about anything getting too violent or too gory. The Rot in the game are simply adorable, and often my children would come in and tell me, hey, let me know when the next Rot is going to appear, so they can come in and watch the little animation that they would do. And one thing quickly that I really liked about this game is that the animations for the Rot as they come into play can be very different. Sometimes it's just the very generic introduction for them, but other times they do have very specific ways in which they are introduced. The difficulty on the game, I could not recommend giving this to a child because the difficulty on the game can really spike during some boss battles. So if you're uncomfortable about having them run into a very difficult fight and get frustrated about it, which young children often do, then I would suggest that this is one that they can watch but not play. The core gameplay here is broken up into 4 key sections. You have combat, you have exploration, there's some collecting, and there's some puzzles. In terms of exploration, players will move around the game world using a variety of fairly basic traversal mechanics, but they will also utilize some of the abilities they learn throughout the game to also traverse the game world. So it's not just a run around or jump through here. You will be using some of the abilities that you learned through the game to progress even further and to reach some of those secrets that you wouldn't be able to reach otherwise. The game itself is basically a zoned off world. So it isn't something that is really open world, and it didn't have to be. I think the path that they took here, where each section or each part of the game world is a zone unto itself, is actually really well done. And with essentially a central hub, which is the main town connecting them, I found it to be fantastic. It definitely is a game that didn't need to be open world, and I'm very glad they didn't take it in that direction. One thing which I really liked with the game world is I never felt like I needed to go back to previous zones to use new abilities that I had learnt to get additional secrets in the past. I love that in this game, they just kept moving you forward. They just kept progressing you through the story and the game itself. Now, whilst in other games that is fantastic, where you learn a new ability and you want to be able to go back and use that to find additional secrets that you couldn't reach before, I felt like in this game it really benefited from just having people continually move forward and the players continually move forward through the game and the story. This just made it so that the story itself, which, whilst we'll get into that more later, it meant that the story was more contained and it allowed you to remember very easily what was happening throughout the story. Kenna can also swim and climb. Now, I will say that both of these did feel fairly underwhelming. We'll just get that out of the way now. Both of these did feel fairly underwhelming in terms of their traversal mechanics through the game world. I felt like swimming was something that was basically not utilized at all, other than just making it so that the game world felt a little more alive with having water areas. In terms of Kenna being able to go under the water, she can't do that. She can just swim on top of the surface. So in general, it's basically another way of her walking from point A to point B, but with a different animation. So for me, that was a bit of a downside. In terms of collectibles, there are a few things that are scattered around the game world. There's not too many that it becomes overbearing. Really what we're looking for are blue crystals, which I'll explain soon what she uses those for, but blue crystals, there's karma, there are meditation points, there are also charms that she can use to increase her offensive and defensive capabilities, and then there's also the rot. The rot are also a very important collectible in the game. I think I ended up with about 70 out of the possible 100. So in terms of combat, what do I want to say here? So there is quite a lot. So combat is really broken down into melee and range. In terms of melee, you have your staff. Now that has a standard normal attack and also a heavy attack. The heavy attack is something that you can actually charge up and you can use on your enemies to deal greater damage. So if you release it at just the right time as it's charging, it'll do more damage. You can also combine both the standard and heavy attacks together, though its usage is fairly limited. You can't get too creative with it, like a heavy attack into two soft attacks, into a heavy attack, into a jumping attack. It's really kept fairly simple. It might be like two standard attacks followed by a heavy will be a combination that you can use. The one thing I will say about the heavy attacks is it does add a secondary element here around your overall positioning. The game does focus on making sure that Kenna is constantly moving, whether it's against bosses or even smaller or flying enemies. The game does push you to want to move all the time to make sure that you're not standing still. So the heavy attack will keep you prone as you're charging up. So just keep that in mind. Now, in each combat encounter, there's generally a combination of ground, but also flying opponents. Now, the flying opponents, you're obviously not going to be able to use your staff on them. So what they have in the game is actually a bow. Now, this was probably my favorite weapon in the game. The bow is very similar to the staff in that it has a basic attack, which you just press it and it fires an arrow, but it also has a charging ability, which is your heavy attack. Now, the charging ability is something that I used all the time, and it was definitely my go-to when I was using that weapon. So the third tool that she has here is actually a bomb. Now this falls somewhere within the short to long range. It's basically a medium range weapon. You operate it by throwing it, and then you need to find a way to trigger that to explode. So either you're going to shoot yourself to cause the explosion, or you basically need to just wait it out and let it explode on its own. Using these three, both the staff, the bow, and the bomb together, can actually create some really entertaining moments in the combat encounters where you are juggling between the three. And I will say that certainly the larger enemies and the bosses for sure, you do want to employ all three of those abilities, and the game will try to get you to do that by use of the larger and the boss enemies will have certain mechanics that you definitely, you don't want to be in melee range for, or you don't want to be at range for. So it will utilize the bosses will utilize abilities to force you to engage against them using the different abilities you have. Now, something else that I also touched on before, which was the rot. Now, they are a collectible, but they do come with some pretty fantastic abilities that they can apply to your three tools there, which was your staff, your bow, and your bomb. You can actually use the rot to increase or add additional abilities to them. So for example, the staff can be turned into kind of like a big hammer attack where the rot will all surround your staff, and then when she slams it down, they will fly forward and it turns into a more of a ranged damaging ability. Now this was actually really good. I used it a lot early on in the game. And then the second one is the bow. The bow can actually be charged up so that the rot can make it so the arrows will pierce the enemies and explode into multiple of them behind it. It was also extremely powerful, especially against a lot of the cursed chests. We'll see you fight, a lot of airborne enemies, whilst also coming up against one or two of the bigger ground enemies. So having an ability that can pierce through, the close range flying enemies and still hit the larger enemies at the back was actually really handy. And then the third one is the bomb. Now the bomb, whilst I loved the idea here, I didn't really employ it all that often. And the way this works is that you throw it, and when it explodes, the rot will maintain kind of like a slow time warp bubble. And everything inside that bubble will really slow down, allowing you to get some great shots on enemies. So you can essentially slow them down and then position yourself behind them to hit their weak points. Now, in terms of weak points, the game does employ weak points on the larger enemies. There are, you'll look for little yellow crystal-like things that will stick out of the enemies, and if you can hit those, you'll deal greater damage. So it is something it's very similar mechanic to something like Horizon Zero Dawn, which is also another Sony game, where they had like the canisters or whatever they were that you could shoot to explode on the mechanical robots. So now we've been talking a lot about the offensive abilities, but she also does have some defensive abilities, which she can lean into when things are starting to get a little bit hairy, and they certainly will. So what she's got is two key things. Firstly, she has a dodge mechanic. Now the dodge mechanic, it's just, I think you're hitting circle, and she can just left or right or forward or back. So she can dodge out of the way of things, and that is really handy and somewhat overpowered. Against the standard enemies, they can never hit you when you're using this. Against the larger enemies, they can sometimes hit you. So it's not always a get out of damage free card, but sometimes they will occasionally nip you. But for the most part, it is fantastic to use against the larger enemies. Now for bosses, this is a bit of a mixed bag. For bosses, I found that especially early on, it was extremely powerful, but then later on into the game, it becomes a scenario where you can dodge, but the opponent or the boss will actually have more than one attack animation. So instead of just a singular slash, it might be a slash followed by two other quick ones. And so if you have used your dodge, suddenly you might be vulnerable for a split second, and usually that split second was enough to catch us on the way out. Now, beyond that, and I didn't use this too much at the start of the game, but she does also have a shield mechanic. Now, the shield is actually extremely useful, and in the end, I did buff that up. There is a skill tree, which we'll get into. I did buff that up somewhat so that the damage that it could absorb was really good. And what she can do with the shield also is turn this into a parry. So if you use your shield at the right time, just as the enemy is attacking you, it will parry them back and will open them up to be able to take further damage. The very last thing I want to mention here on combat is towards the end of the game, Kenna does get something that can be used for both offensive and defensive, which I thought was actually really useful. And this is essentially a kind of forward charge or warp. So she kind of disappears quickly and appears further up ahead. Now, this can be used both defensively to get out of things. So for example, you might roll out of an attack, and then before I mentioned that sometimes they'll still catch you on the other end of that. But what you can do is roll and then use this teleport as a secondary movement skill to actually get out of the way fairly quickly. And I found that those two together really opened up the later fights to be able to get away from enemy attacks without taking any damage. And then secondly, and this was actually really cool, I love the way that this works in combat, is you can actually use it to charge forward and interrupt enemies that are charging up abilities. So really cool one to use. Make sure you give that a try on some of the more difficult bosses. I think you'll find that that's very useful. Now the last element that the game uses here is puzzles. Now puzzles admittedly are kept very simple. However, what I did like about them is that it made you utilize the abilities that you were using for combat out in the game world. So for example, you could use the bow as a grapple. So in very specific sections, they would have these flowers that would open up, and by shooting the flowers, you could grapple to them. So just know that this isn't a traversal mechanic allowing you to get to any ledge at any point in time. They are very specific nodes. But I thought that was a really cool idea, and they used that to have kind of move around the game world in puzzles. So the other one here is the bomb. Now the bomb, I really loved this mechanic when I first saw it, and I hoped they would use it a lot throughout the game, and they did, but I've got to say now that I didn't feel like they used it to the maximum potential that it had. Anyway, so the way it works is you throw a bomb on very specific rock formations, you then shoot that bomb or let it trigger or explode in some way, and it will turn those rock formations into platforms. So what you get are puzzles where Kenna is moving around the game world trying to solve a very simple puzzle. Hey, it might be, hey, let's get up here and hit these statues into a very specific order to light up the path. But to get there, you'll have to use these traversal mechanics for the bomb to create those platforms, and then also a combination of the flowers for the grapples to move around as well. So whilst they did use all of those during the puzzle mechanics, I felt like it was very underused at the end of the day. Now let's get into what I liked and what I didn't like. So what didn't I like about this? Let's do that first. So what I didn't like necessarily was the crystals, which was one of the currencies they have in the game, or the collectibles. Now, what you use these for is really just cosmetic purposes to put hats on your rots. Now, the rots, which we didn't get into too much, but my kids call them squishy mellows, and they are basically these little squishy, lovable little creatures that help Kenna along the way. However, you can put hats on them. And really that's all this currency is used for. It's just buying hats for each of your rot. Now, I did love that visually, when you purchase a hat for one of the rots, they will turn up and the rots will follow you in the game world. Super cool, super loved it, but it is a bit of a letdown that that's the only thing that the crystals are used for, despite being the primary thing that you're finding in the game world. The next thing that I didn't really like all that much in the game was the difficulty spikes. Now, whilst it was never so difficult that it stopped me, sometimes it did catch me off guard, because you would get to a boss fight which would be super easy. You wouldn't die or anything like that. You'd get straight through it, no problem. The mechanics would be really easy and no problems. But then the very next fight would be a lot more difficult. You might die 3 or 4 times before you work out, okay, here's the patterns that I have to remember that the boss is using. This is what I need to employ to get past them. However, that can be really frustrating when you get to a boss that's super easy, and then one that's pretty difficult, and then one that's super easy again. You sit there and you wonder, okay, well, why aren't they just consistently the same difficulty? And then I did touch on this before, but the puzzles, I did feel like they were a little underutilized. So, really, and especially the rots. The rots are something that you get in the game which have a major focus point, right? And so you're getting the crystals, which is something I said was a negative already, using the crystals to buy the hats. But in terms of the rots and the puzzles, there's some really simple, puzzle things where you just get the rot to pick something up and move it. And that's it. That's all it is. You're just getting them to move things from point A to point B. And that to me was a real letdown. I would have loved to have seen ways in which, you needed to have the rot work together with your traversal mechanics like the bomb and the bow, and then also having a puzzle mixed into that and having it so that they all come together. Because as it was, typically the puzzles with the rots were just, hey, move this to here and that's the end of the puzzle. It never really felt like they put all of them together to create really engaging puzzles, which is a shame, but it also does lend itself to the fairly easy difficulty aspects of the game. Now, bugs. Bugs. Every game has them nowadays, but I'm happy to say here that this game was very, very well polished. I didn't encounter any bugs throughout my whole journey except for one. The very last boss. So in the very last boss, after 3 or 4 deaths, probably 4 or 5 actually, I killed the boss and the boss fell on top of me as it died and I got stuck inside the corpse. Now, this was the worst possible bug to me because, visual issues or sound issues, all of those sorts of things I can deal with. But when I actually kill the final boss and I get stuck inside the corpse and cannot progress to the ending after having failed, 4 times prior, it was extremely frustrating. And I did want to put the controller down because of that and walk away. Now, ultimately I didn't, and I fought the boss again, got through it no problems, but still that was 10 minutes of my time that I had to redo again to complete the boss a second time, and ultimately I did, but I have to mention it here. Make sure that boss does not land on you, because you will get stuck in it and you cannot get out. Now, whilst we're on the boss, one thing here that was quite underwhelming to me was that final boss and the mechanics and how you had to defeat it. So what they've done here is they've basically made it so that the abilities that you learn throughout the game are near useless on the boss itself. Really, all you can use is the bow and its most basic charge attacks. The additional ability to get through your rocks and things like that, none of those can be employed in this fight at all. Now, there are 3 stages to this fight, and when I say at all, I mean all 3 sections of that fight you can't use your rod abilities for in terms of actually damaging the boss itself. Now, the boss does have minions that just keep coming, and you can use them on those to some degree, but because of those enemies being, one-hit kills, it's super pointless. It's super pointless. Now, I thought that because of that, it made the skill tree that I went into almost useless. So now, what was great in the game? What did I really enjoy? Firstly, the aesthetics and the overall appearance and just how beautiful the game world and the art direction in this game was. There's definitely a cutesy element here with the rot. And that is really, really great for kids to be able to come in and watch, but also the cartoony look of the game and just the general character designs I thought were really, really good and really well done. So, well, kudos to Ember Labs for that. That was really, really fantastic.
The forest is huge. How do we know where to look?
Maybe Mr. Russo can help us. His house is up that way.
I can feel her presence everywhere. These fields are scarred with memories of destruction.
And in terms of the cinematics, they were really, really well done as well. So that is something else just to commend them on. They are really beautiful. And some of the emotional grabs during those scenes are also there as well, which came across beautifully in both the visual appearance, but also the sound and the music. But the music in the game is fantastic. There was certainly a couple of moments in the world where I just kind of stopped and just let the music play for a little bit. Maybe I'm just doing something else, but just letting the music play in the background. So the music and sound here as well were fantastic. Definitely something that I appreciated that they did. Definitely a strength to the game. Now, boss fights. I did mention that the last boss was, something that was on the underwhelming list, but in terms of the other bosses, whilst the difficulty spikes are there, the more difficult fights do make you think a bit more about how to defeat them. So, for example, there's a fight here called the Hunter. I believe that's what it's called, and it's essentially a flying enemy that you need to defeat, and he moves around using a bow, keeping you at range the entire time. So my first instinct was just to use the bow and just bow him down. But if you use the bomb as well, you can actually throw the bomb and he will focus his priority on attacking the bomb, leaving him open and vulnerable and standing stationary. Something that we also haven't touched on here much is the skill tree. Now, this is a positive for me, really, because it's just kept it super simple. The game itself is fairly short at 12 to 16 hour runtime, so I didn't want and I wasn't expecting to see a really massive skill tree. So I did really appreciate the smallness of the skill tree, and really what you're doing is just unlocking 3 or 4 abilities for your key offensive and defensive tool sets. So that to me is a positive, and I'm glad they didn't make this super elaborate and try to make it so that you would only max everything out after 3 or 4 new game plus runs. Now, the last thing I wanted to touch on here around, I wasn't sure whether to put this in the underwhelming or the enjoyable aspect of it, but the story. Now, one thing that I came into this game with was, having seen things online, people saying online that the story here was really engaging, really emotional, and was really quite beautiful. Now, I have to say, I'm not one to normally not get emotional in games. There's certainly games that bring out a lot of emotion in me. This was one that did not fall into that basket. So for me, this story was definitely not a low light and not a highlight either. It's something that kind of sat in the middle. It was not great. It was not bad. It was just okay. So where are we ending up here with Kenna Bridge of Spirits? We spoke about some good things, some of the things we liked. We also spoke about some of the things we didn't necessarily like. We spoke about the combat mechanics, the traversal mechanics, and so many games these days are 20 to 30 hours long. And one of the things that I do want to put here right at the end of the video, which I thought for me just made this game so much better, was that it's short runtime. For me, it's 16 hours and the average being at 12. I do want to highlight this because, as I said, so many games are pushing for those higher end hours to make sure that players feel like they're getting a lot for their money. And I will say that this game never ever overstayed its welcome. By the time those credits rolled, I was fully happy for that story to be over, and I felt like I was really satisfied with it. Now, in terms of overall score, I think I'm looking at about an 8 out of 10 here. I would have loved to have seen them do a little bit more with a little bit more with the puzzle mechanics, and just really tying in everything that you learned into more complicated puzzles. But as it was, they kept things really simple around the puzzles. So Ember Labs, if you ever see this, that's one thing that I'd love for you to make on Kenna, more Bridge of Spirits 2. Thank you for watching this video, and take care, guys.